Ferry, I think from my side, let's start on the global session or the global sector. We've seen the two spikes in the prices due to the Chinese, I would say the Chinese factor. Can you perhaps just explain to us a little bit more on what does that entail and what's the big drivers behind that big demand?
Yeah, that's a good question, and Dirk, you must also please come in here. So essentially those two spikes that we had, actually the 2013 spike in global prices was mainly due, was drought introduced with a big drought in the northern hemisphere. And that's where we saw prices running quite a bit. At that time already the Chinese demand was strong, but it was mainly driven by the drought conditions. That was the first spike. And the second spike, we really had a combination, a perfect storm. In the northern hemisphere, you know, your soybean production in the US and Brazil, it was not bad. We actually had good production levels. But the combination of over the years, we had slightly lower prices after that peak in 2013. And for 4, 5 years, 6 years, prices of moving sideways. We had yield increases, and there was not really, and stock levels were starting to come down, as I've explained. And then we had this combination where we had the African swine fever. Now estimates are that China lost about 50% of their herd of pigs, and then there was some filling of the market very quickly with chickens, with broilers. But now they're really rebuilding their herd, and they just drew on a lot of stocks, importing a lot of soybeans and just drawing down stocks even further. Now, data coming out of some of those countries is difficult to interpret. So we don't know how high those stock levels really are and to what extent, but we can certainly see in the global trade numbers that they've come down significantly. So they're not as aggressive as last year. So we are anticipating, therefore, you know, it seems like the equilibrium is reached there, and now it's obviously a question of production increasing again in response to these very high prices, and therefore the reduction in prices going forward.
I think to add on to that is the part we must not also forget is that how trade difficulties between the US and China as well. So that started before this big demand pull. So that also created a big starting block for a huge demand increase, because there was a bit of a standstill. There was a first demand trying to do animal feeds differently. And then when that was sorted out, you suddenly seen this big vacuum happening in terms of demand as well, together with the swine flu and everything. So it was like a perfect storm in creating a demand vacuum in that regard.
Yes. If I remember correctly, the Alltech feed survey showed that 2 years back, before the African swine fever, showed that pork would have overtaken poultry as the protein source, and the African swine fever, and the rest is history. So the pork, a figure I remember specifically was that China lost more than 300 million pigs that they had to slaughter. So that takes a huge chunk out of their flocks. So, but let's move over to a question from the viewers, and the question here, I can't see from whom it is, but let's take the question. I understood that the selecting rhizobium that are adapted to specific soils is very important. I believe the resistance to antibiotics like streptomycin from Actinomycetes helped in Brazil. I think this let's ask what. That's more. Yes, that seems like a statement, but that's more kind of soil related. Yeah. Do we refer it to the next session, or because that's agronomy
I
related?
think the previous session also talked about the selection. of the rhizobia.
Yeah.
So I think maybe that can be
Perhaps,
passed also to the colleagues of our previous session.
I think just to state the vet, definitely it's playing a very large role in the industry. So it's playing it's making a big contribution in that regard, and it's like Ferdy said, it's all about the selection of it and making the handling of it, making sure you get the right effects out of it.
Yeah.
But it is, like you mentioned, it's a more technical agronomic
Question. Yes.
question,
Ferry, you showed a slide there of the region, soya production, and of course also processing, and of course South Africa is the largest processor in the region. We saw the production numbers, but can you perhaps just embroider a little bit on what's the quality of our neighboring or regional role players, and what I know the Zambian quality is quite good, but I'm not up to speed with the other neighbors.
Yeah, that's a very good question, and I think the vet also, they are specialists in the industry that buy and process that product. So our understanding, maybe the first point is just it's non-GM in our neighboring country. So that's an important distinction to make. And some of those beans are actually coming in. I know some of those Zambian beans were coming in as non-GM in the human use market. So it's a very important market to keep your eye on in terms of human use products. And there was actually some very interesting trade dynamics happening in this current season, where India suddenly pulled a lot of those non-GM beans were exported into the Indian market because there was an issue around non-GM, and then suddenly was opened up for GM beans. And as I've mentioned in my presentation, unfortunately, our information in terms of supply and demand dynamics in those markets, it's extremely difficult.
Yes.
So it's like a puzzle. You have to kind of piece this thing together. And what we often do is we use a mirror image data on trade to understand where is that product appearing somewhere else. So if there were, and for example, there were quite a bit of beans exported out of Mozambique. Malawi exported some beans. So the vet, overall, it's a non-GM. There are some very good qualities that we've seen coming out of those markets, and we've even used that in our local market. And I think it's a mix and a match of quality coming out of those markets. But we certainly need more in understanding. Just the interesting part is, if you follow their expansion path, I've mentioned they were most of them net importers, and they quickly filled the local market, and now they're stuck. Yeah. So we see Zambia stuck at 320,000 tons, not really expanding because it's too expensive. They are landlocked. Yeah. If you want to move those beans, taking it, let's say, from Lusaka down to South Africa, or even to the Durban Harbour or Beira, it costs you $150, $180 a ton.
Yes.
It's just too expensive to move the beans currently out of those countries.
But I think a part that Ferry touched on as well is, in the whole trade environment, the whole GM trades is playing a very important role as well. So the countries are very specific in terms of what they import. And it's not just if a country is importing and it's GM favored imports, it's also in terms of the different GM trades that's in your country and that's in their country. So that is part of the stuff that makes trade more complex, and it's not just as easy as sending it to a country or making an agreement. There's a lot of policies and a lot of things on the background that's facilitating this, and like Ferdy mentioned, this our neighboring countries are more non-GM orientated in that regard as well.
Yes, thank you, Dirk. I think let's just take another question from the viewers. We see the question there on the screen. How significant the Notill and cover crop approach contributes to the difference in yield between the US and us? Now, I remember when you put up the production slide, Notill is definitely the preferred method these days, and with the higher yields, of course, which came along with that. Could you perhaps give us can I say, just background on that?
Yeah, I think the way to answer it in that instance is The first thing is it depends on what region we're talking about. South Africa, our climate is very diverse in terms of the different production regions. So what we've seen in the eastern part of the countries, the eastern part of the country, we've seen a lot more adaptation to Notill practices, getting involved in terms of it.
Yep.
But one must remember is Notill is not just doing it a practice. It's a science at the end of the day of looking at what the resources is that you have in your soils, what's the climate resources you have, and finding that golden space that where it's working for you. So it's difficult to compare it in terms of one country to another country. What we've learned from those countries, we used to do trials and testing in South Africa to find that golden space for us. So definitely we've learned a lot from them. We try to adapt it as well, but it's reliant on a lot of different factors. And for instance, on the western side of the country, there's still a lot to learn in terms of it. The eastern side of the country, there's more progress in terms of that.
Yes.
Is it a good thing for the future? Definitely. We're talking about moisture conservation. We're talking about farming with moisture, and this is one of the practices that helps you doing it. But it takes time to establish. It's not something you just do overnight. There's different steps in order to get there, and that takes some time. And I'm sure with this critical mass of production increase we've seen the last few years, this will fast track the practices as well in specific regions. In some of the regions, in some cases, there's still lessons to learn. In some cases, it doesn't make sense yet to do it on a traditional Notill basis. So the question is, how do you adapt to that? What's the new innovations we need to do?
Definitely.
I think maybe just something also to...
Yeah.
The reality is, you always talk about your meter of soil and a meter of rain. And that's what the Americans have in a big part, where they're producing beans and maize.
Yes.
And we in South Africa, where we are planting our beans, we are at 500, 600 millimeters. We are not there, and our soils are maybe at a half a meter. We have only a few places in South Africa where we have that quality of soils. So quality and rainfall climate obviously has a big impact to play.
Yes.
So it's not a blueprint. It's not taking a blueprint from there, putting it down here. It's learning our own lessons of how to work with it.
Yeah, I mean the US also have the benefit of the snowfalls in winter and that additional water that it brings, or soil moisture.
Exactly.
Right. Just a question from one of the viewers, Tersis De Jager. Thank you for the question. What specific varieties is needed for human requirements?
That's a good question, and I think our colleagues in the next session, will give us a more accurate answer on that. So in short, I think there's been in the regions, for example in Asia, where we've seen major tofu markets, etc. There's been this natural selection where they know which bean to plant over time, which really fits into their market. But I think there are some specialists that really can talk about that in the session afterwards.
Yes.
To what extent is there really a selection process officially, or this is kind of just the market that is adapted and knows what it wants and figures out over time what are the varieties that feed into this specific market?
But I think what one can link to that is the research work your team did, Ferry, in terms of just looking at our biggest consumer currently, the feed market, and to see what the difference is in terms of protein and oil content, and it differs within the country as well, and that's where we talked about finding that space where we get stability, because the moment you get stability, your uptake takes up easier in that regard as well. But yet again, it's a difficult thing of climate, of production practices, of where it's produced. It's a combination of all this. It's not just the cultivar thing. There's a lot of different combinations providing that.
Yes. I remember seeing a question up there on the moving towards self-sufficiency and of course pricing moving to export parity. The question was, what mechanisms should we have in place and make sure we have in place to be sustainable going forward at that high volume produced, of course, and prices at which we will remain sustainable as farmers, as also processors in this country. Your views on this, gentlemen?
Yeah, I think, your obviously the processors are very happy, and the whole supply chain if you can provide a consistent supply of your raw material at a good price,
Yes.
at obviously export parity, good quality, that just boosts the overall feed market and ultimately the livestock market, Dirk, that you alluded to, in terms of your exports and making that more competitive. For what's implication for the farmers? And there we've talked about it quite a bit, is in terms of what can you do? What are the levers? So price, you can't really do much about that. That's the market. And we've seen that this level of self-sufficiency in maize, and maybe that's something that we can learn from, we have areas, and I think there will be this consolidation of areas where you have some more marginal areas, and you'll see them moving slightly in to production if we move, if there's a bit of a premium above export parity. And I normally, my rule of thumb for maize is around 200,000 hectares. Yeah. And we see 200,000 hectares moving in. And if we are 2-3 seasons at export parity levels, whoops, you see them moving out again. Yeah. And I think going forward, if we assume that our productivity rates are going to increase at the pace, the SACTA system, Dirk, that you talked about, and the new varieties that are coming in. But that's really critical that, government, the registrar's office, everything needs to be in place, that we ensure we get the best technology onto farm, whether these are our emerging farmers, new entrants coming to markets. We need the best technology there. We need the best farming practices there, mentorship programs there, and information out to the farmer base, that we ensure we really get at a large scale across all the farmers, we get this productivity level boosted overall.
Yeah, I think the vet to add to on a farmer's side is, we get a lot of times a question to say, but if you keep the production at specific levels, you're going to have a good price in that regard. But what we've seen as well is, given this record prices where we now, it's similar to prices that we had in 2012. It's more or less the similar levels on the international market. So what that means is, price we see is not really increasing that big in terms of going forward, providing the income side. You have your normal inflation type of things, but if you look at it, it's quite a stable environment going forward. The second thing is, if you look at it from an input cost side, is the price cost squeeze is a reality, and everyone knows that as well. So in order to eliminate the effect of the price cost squeeze, you need to have the efficiency in terms of an increase of a yield basis. Yeah. So the yield increase is providing the sustainability into this factor. And the moment you do that part, then it's where you go to surplus productions, where you need to have this export release holes. And that's where it becomes very important to provide the stabilization. And the moment you're in this long periods at export parity, you need this release holes until this marginal hectares get that equilibrium again where we feel comfortable, and you can carry on in terms of it. So it's a combination of all that. If you stand still, the sustainability is dropping down. You need that increase, but at the result of that is that you're going to an export market at the end of the day.
Yes, no, totally agree. That's why I value the soya value chain so greatly. It's a value chain approach. We're all part of it, and that's precisely the platform where this negotiations and taking hands as different role players and value chain partners should be, to give that to our end consumer at the end of the day, and still our farmer must also be profitable. I just want to take a last question from Vuyo. And Ferry, I think that follows on your graph there on the crushing capacity, and we all know in total we're looking at 1.7 and adding if you full fat, if you add that, it's just over 2 million. What's your view on potential expansion of crushing capacity in this country?
Yeah, that's a good question, David, and it's so maybe just to take a step back. It was a real no-brainer when we didn't have crushing capacity at all, and we were at import parity with the meal, we were at import parity with the oil, and we were starting to produce surpluses of beans. So, and we had these scenarios, you'll remember 2007 and 8, and we're building these scenarios saying, you know, is it going to be chicken egg? Is it going to be crushers first expand much faster than what we currently have, or which way is it going to go? And you know, there was this policy around the investment from DTIC and from IDC, and there was these plants just jumped up like mushrooms, and it was wonderful. So we have this capacity now, but as Dirk and I mentioned, we're getting close to this capacity now of 2 million tons. And the question is, if you know, when would you invest? What will pull the trigger of the next crushing plant? We still have dual plants. We must not forget that.
Yes.
So we have sunflower plants that could come in and add some more crushing capacity periodically. But if we get consistently higher, and this links back to your integrated value chain question, if we can get the master plan to assist with very specific interventions, that we have faster growth in meat production, that derive demand for feed.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you know, we're going to be at this level of around 2.2 million tons in that area, and then it becomes, you know, there might be a smaller plant, maybe towards the west, that could find a gap if margins are there. But you know, we really need something special in the value chain to open up more demand, and that we can take it. And then obviously the transportation issue that we mentioned.
Yes,
we have 30%. You saw that our projections is that still about 240,000 ton of meal in the coastal areas coming in. Now, if we could replace some of that meal through more efficient railing down of the meal, or just a reduction in the transportation costs, I think then there would be a merit for another plant.
Yes, I think one of the drivers, I would say, or igniters, let's call it that, and Dirk mentioned that, is we need a good export market to be developed. Either poultry, beef, pork even, specific cuts. I mean, that will be a driver for actually a pull action that will pull this production even higher, and that will necessitate, of course, extra crushing capacity and more, I would say, more specific crushing capacity on specific soya or sunflower.
I think, David, if you step back a bit and say, all right, what would be the country's view? What would we want to achieve as a country? What we want to achieve is we want to process local, we want to make sure we produce local, and we export final products. That's where when you grow an economy.
Yes.
For producers' side, export market in terms of beans is favorable because it gives us that quick release side. But ultimately, you want that demand resonating in the local industry. And specifically with the soybeans, if you just go a bit back in 2009, we were in a scenario where we exported soybeans and imported the processed product, which does not make economic sense. And the goal here would always be to try and get the local processing running. But like Ferdy said, in order to get that, we need a few factors to get into place.
Definitely.
Phytosanitary, all those type of issues that we need to make sure that we have this efficient export markets, registration of products, to get that as quick as possible. So there's a few stuff we've increased. Now we're there at a space where we need a few efficiencies to kick in, and the moment that kicks in, and then we have a new demand side in terms of that, and I think that's very important. It's that small efficiencies where we're going to sit as a value chain and correct that. And I think we had different steps. We were together as a value chain, sitting together and say, what are we going to do with the import oil cakes? We went and did analysis, look at the quality of the oil cakes, all that, and we could find one another, and suddenly we had this big jump in demand where we substituted imported oil cake. Now we yet again had a new one to say, right, what's the next steps? What's the next things to get us that quick parts movement?
Definitely. Yes, and I also just want to mention that part of this soya value chain is a big partner of us is government, bringing in, or can I say, establishing enabling environment for us. Like you've said, the SPSs should be in place, Act 36, the legislation should be in place to get our products quicker, can I say, quicker to the market. to bring in that efficiencies, and that will also be a big driver of a pull factor for the production to increase, and as well as products to be processed. Yeah. So it is can I say, it's a value chain approach. It's an economic approach with the partnership with government, of course, and our value chain partners. Gentlemen, thank you very much. It was a great session and sharing the stage with you. And I think our viewers out there, they also enjoyed it. And I'm very sure there will be a few questions still coming forth to Gerard and the Protein Research Foundation. So we will be, please send them in. We will be waiting for that. And just before we break, I can just announce that the lunch break will be until 12:45. Thank you very much. And Ferry and Dirk, thanks again.
Thanks very much.
It was great spending the time with you.
Thank you.
A lot of fun. Thanks very much.